Bedford, PA video tour stop number 8, the Espy House.
And this is the last stop on our tour. The Espy House behind me was built in 1771. The guy that built it, David Espy. Actually, he was an officer later on during the Revolutionary War, a good friend of George Washington's, and he would later host President Washington in 1794 under some interesting circumstances. And here's how that came to be. When the Revolutionary War was over, sometimes it's just assumed, well, the Revolutionary War is over, bam, we're a country, we know what we're doing. That wasn't the case. After the Revolutionary War was over, the big question was, what now? What do we do? It took several years, it took many years to basically nail down exactly how our government was going to work. In 1787, the Constitution is drafted up. It's pretty much finalized. We decided what it was going to look like. It wasn't until 1789, maybe even 1790, I think the last state ratified the Constitution of the United States. So by the early 1790s anyway, we're happening with the Constitution. And one element of the Constitution allowed for taxation. The government needed to raise money from time to time. And the government did need to raise money. Why? We had a lot of debt left over from the Revolutionary War. You see, Revolutionary War soldiers that served during that time had not yet been paid, a decade or more later. Now, a lot of the Revolutionary War veterans just had sort of written off that, and they figured, well, we won't be paid. They never expected to receive their money. The government's attitude was, if we owe money to anybody, if we have a debt, we pay that debt. So the government decided it was going to raise some funds to pay off its Revolutionary War debts. They could have passed a tax on land, but they didn't. They passed a tax on whiskey. So Congress has passed a tax on whiskey. And why was that seen as so obscene around here? Well, here's why. Let's say you're a farmer in this area of the mountains, okay? And you are raising crops. Well, if you're raising crops right around this area and everybody else is a farmer, it's pretty tough to sell grain to the guy next to you who's also raising the same thing. So you would take your grain or whatever it was you were raising to market. In this area, sometimes with the mountains, it was very difficult to get to. You would go over mountainous roads, and I'm just going to make up a number here. Don't pay any attention to the number necessarily. It's just for illustrative purposes. Let's say you load up your wagon, and you, Mr. Farmer, you go out with your goods, and you go out for one day, you come back with $1. Well, it was a lot of work to do, so that means you had to make 10 trips to make $10. With me? Let's say while you're doing your other farming duties around this area, you boiled that grain that you normally might put on your wagon. You boiled it down to whiskey. You then, at a later date, put the whiskey on your wagon, took it to market, and came back. You went out for one day, you came back with $10. So instead of 10 trips for $10, you made one trip for $10. Whiskey was your microwave oven. It's a time-saving device. It's a way that you could be more efficient in getting things done. Whiskey was your cash crop. So whenever Congress passed a tax on whiskey, it was a major affront to the farmers around here. That's almost like taxing your money. I think they do that now anyway. So the farmers decided they weren't going to take that lying down, and many of them let the government know their displeasure. Many of the farmers would show up outside the local magistrates' homes and express their displeasure. Let's say you're a sheriff enforcing the law. You are Sheriff Dan. You show up outside the home of Farmer Fred. You say, Mr. Farmer Fred, I understand that you just made a whiskey run, and I am going to ask you to pay your tax on the whiskey that you sold. Farmer Fred says, well, I'm not going to pay that tax. I just don't think it's right. And Sheriff Dan says, I don't care what you think is right. You pay your tax, or I'm going to lead you off to jail. So Sheriff Dan leads Farmer Fred off to jail. Meanwhile, Farmer Fred's friends, Farmer Ned, Farmer Ed, and Farmer Ted, show up outside the home of Sheriff Dan. They knock on the home of Sheriff Dan. Boom, 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 boom. Sheriff Dan opens the door. Farmer Ned, Farmer Ed, and Farmer Ted drag Sheriff Dan out, strip him naked, and, of course, beat the living tar out of him, because that makes it all worthwhile. Some of these colorful anecdotes, you understand, are just for illustrative purposes. But I can tell you this. The local sheriffs, the local magistrates, were sometimes accosted, not just around here, even more west towards Berlin, even into Pittsburgh. There was absolute displeasure. There was absolute anger over the whiskey tax. Word of this reaches President Washington in Philadelphia. Is that okay? Quite frankly, President Washington wasn't really too crazy about the whiskey tax in the first place. He didn't think it was a good idea. Well, that didn't matter. You see, President Washington figured it this way. I'm not the legislative branch of government. I'm the executive branch of government. So President Washington decides, is that okay if people break the law? No, it's not. So he formed the Constitutional Army, 13,000 troops in the Philadelphia area. And 13,000 troops marched west to enforce the Constitution. They sent out scouts in reverse, quite frankly. They made no secret that they were coming. They weren't trying to sneak up on anybody. They sent out reports that they were coming, because the last thing they wanted to do was surprise somebody and have somebody be surprised to see them and shoot at them. You want to know something? Somebody shoots at you, you got to shoot back, and people get hurt that way, and that's a bad thing. So announce that you're coming, not with 13 men, not even with 130 men. No, we're coming to visit with 13,000 men. Many of the farmers in the local area here, learning of this, and they believe the reports, they went on vacation. Many of the farmers left. So President Washington arrives into Bedford. By the way, he was greeted as a hero. People standing out on the streets, cheering to see him, which sometimes made me wonder, wait a minute, if we're so upset about the whiskey tax, how is it to President Washington that he has people outside cheering to see him? Well, quite frankly, while the tax was not thought much of, President Washington was greatly respected. He was thought to be a great man even by the locals here who didn't care much for the whiskey tax. So President Washington is greeted. He arrives into the town of Bedford. He is housed at the Espy House behind me. Colonel David Espy, who owned the Espy House, was a friend of President Washington's. And, of course, he stayed here because it was, one, the nicest house in town. Where else would you have the president stay? And, two, he was good friends with Colonel Espy. So President Washington makes his quarters here at the Espy House. 13,000 troops have come down to this part of western Pennsylvania. Washington stays here in Bedford. The troops, some of them, push further west. As I told you, the farmers, many of them had already left. And Washington was only here for a few days. But quite frankly, he tried to make the point that, I know some of you had a question, are we a country or aren't we a country? The answer is, yes, we are a country. Now, certainly some of the locals made the point that, wait a minute, wait, President Washington, listen to me. We just got done fighting a war against taxation. And here we are taxed again. That's why we're so upset. Washington says, no. You didn't get done fighting a war against taxation. You got done fighting a war against taxation without representation. You know what? You don't like the law? Vote! You've got representation now. If your Congress hasn't passed the taxes that you like, you change your Congress, because now you have that ability. You have representation. Change your representative. Don't fight against the law. So the Whiskey Rebellion is put down. The farmers, many of them have left the area. President Washington, after a few days, leaves. But the question was, are we a country or aren't we? President Washington said, yep, we are. Many of the farmers, by the way, I told you went on vacation. Any idea where they went? Many of the farmers decided that they didn't care much for the federal government telling them what they could and couldn't do with their whiskey. So those farmers moved far enough away that they figured the federal government would go, it's just too far, just let them. Where they went to was Kentucky. Many of the Bedford and Berlin area whiskey makers became Kentucky moonshiners. That's where they come from. A lot of the recipes for the Kentucky whiskeys came from western Pennsylvania. So that's a little story about the Espy House. I hope you enjoyed our little tour. We thank you for coming to the local area. If you'd like more information about the local area and even the region, you can go to either bedfordcounty.net or thealleghanies.com. These two sources are websites that have visitor information that you may find interesting. So thanks, folks. I hope you enjoyed our little tour. See ya.